Previously on this program, we talked about Iranians who love the West. We discussed the history behind this cultural trend, recounting many instances of Euro-loving Iranian intellectuals in the 19th and 20th centuries. Since the 1979 revolution, the Iranian state has politically opposed the West and Israel. This political fight didn't come about in a social vacuum. It is state policy that finds considerable social and popular support. So, where did this Iranian interest in fighting Western imperialism come from? We also talked about the history of the Pahlavi state, which ruled Iran from 1925 to 1979, how it confounded progress with an imitation of Western culture, and how a lot of what happened in the 19th and 20th centuries continue to impact popular belief to this day, which might be why the majority of Iranians today, as polls indicate, have a favorable view of America, even though it sanctions them, while opposing cooperation agreements with China and Russia. Iran is a pretty diverse country, not just in ethnicities and languages, but also in terms of political beliefs. Since the 1979 revolution, the Iranian state has politically opposed the West and Israel. This political fight didn't come about in a social vacuum. In 1951, the secular nationalists, led by the Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, fought for oil sovereignty, with considerable initial success. The British had controlled Iranian oil and profit since 1908, when oil was discovered in southwest Iran. Mossadegh nationalized Iranian oil, then pushed for substantial limits on the power of the king known as the Shah. The Shah had lost political support and was unable to topple Mossadegh in an initial coup attempt, so he fled the country, eventually ending up in Italy. However, the British and the US came together, using the connections inside Iran, including those at the US embassy, to orchestrate a military coup against Mossadegh. A second coup attempt, led by General Zahedi, a veteran statesman who opposed Mossadegh, succeeded in August of 1953. The Shah returned to the country and British control over Iranian oil was restored. So, the Shah came to rule Iran through a foreign coup. Sure, his supporters to this day claim that an organic national uprising against Mossadegh brought him back to power. But the scholarship just doesn't seem to support this claim. Even if there was some support from the streets, there's no question that the Anglo-American intervention was the necessary factor that made it all happen. Indeed, the Americans have admitted that they played an active role in orchestrating the 1953 coup d'etat. Iranians knew this, and they hated the fact that someone ruled over them who was indebted to the British and the Americans. Iranians were reminded rather frequently of the Shah's special alliance to Britain and the United States. For instance, major streets in the capital Tehran were named by the Shah after Queen Elizabeth of England and President Dwight Eisenhower of the United States. So Mossadegh's tenure ended in defeat, but the coup created a crisis of legitimacy for the Shah and resulted in 2 decades of intense social mobilization against him. The social mobilization took off in the 1960s. Over time, the opposition to the Shah and Western imperialism shifted from the secular nationalist camp towards the Muslim and socialist camp. 2 important figures came to dominate the intellectual and political scene. The first was Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, who eventually became the spiritual and political leader of the revolution. He was a high-ranking Muslim cleric who believed that Iranians had been lied to. Colonialism had made him think that Islam had no role in politics or in fighting injustice, that religion was just about rituals and a spiritual life and had no business getting involved in the affairs of the modern state. Khomeini disagreed, so he argued that Islam provides rules for every aspect of life, including social and political aspects. And more controversially, he advanced the position that Muslim jurists such as himself were especially qualified to rule the state. The second influential figure was Ali Shariati. Shariati did not come from a background of religious education like Ayatollah Khomeini had. He was a layman who studied sociology at Sorbonne University in France, but nonetheless found inspiration in the more rebellious elements of Shiism, Iran's dominant sect of Islam.
در دوره صفویه این روحانیت شیعه در کنار حاکم قرار میگیره و در کنار شخص حاکم. در اینجا مذهب تشیع تغییر جهت میده. تشیع ضد وضع موجود تشیع وفق وضع موجود میشه. تشیعی که به عنوان یک نیرو در برابر حاکمیت بود، به عنوان یک نیرو در کنار و در پشت سر این قدرت می ایسته و از یک جانبداری میکنه، کارش و نقشش هم عوض میشه.
Shariati popularized Red Shiism, a Shiism that sought out social and political justice. He argued that Red Shiism dated back to the early days of Islam, personified in sacred figures such as Fatima, Prophet Muhammad's daughter, and Hussein, his grandson. From the Shia perspective, Hussein was martyred for fighting injustice. This contrasted with Black Shiism, propagated by the clerical establishment. This version of Shiism, according to Shariati, tolerated injustice in the present, putting all the energies on rituals of mourning. Red symbolized the blood spilled in pursuit of justice, while black symbolized the color black worn during apolitical mourning ceremonies. Shariati's Red Shiism, which revived Hussein's legacies of fighting injustice, took off among the Iranian revolutionaries. Shariati also read Islamic history in the scripture through Marxist writings, seeing the world in terms of the oppressed versus the oppressor, or the wealthy and the dispossessed. He influenced a wide range of political movements against the Shah, which brought together socialism, anti-imperialism, and Islam. By the 1970s, Islamic politics had penetrated Iran deeply, so much so that the secular nationalist political parties of the Mossadegh era had become religiously oriented. One example was the Liberation Movement of Iran. The Liberation Movement was the oldest opposition group to the Shah. It evolved from opposing the Shah from an implicit secular standpoint to an increasingly religiously oriented movement. The Liberation Movement's most notable member, Mehdi Bazargan, became the prime minister of the provisional government after the 1979 revolution. Of course, the different political movements and personalities behind the revolution had their disagreements. Ayatollah Khomeini didn't have much respect for the likes of Bazargan. He described them as American Muslims. This meant that they weren't serious enough about establishing an Islamic republic, at least from Khomeini's perspective.
اسلام شناسی تقریبا به تورم است. صدام هم اسلام شناس بوده است. آقای سادات هم جز اسلام شناس هست که تشخیص میدن که فلان هم موافق اسلام هم موافق اسلام نیست. اخیراً آقای کارتر هم جز اسلام شناس هست. در یه جلسه که مسافرت کرده گفتن این کارهایی که در ایران فلان میکنن این موافق اسلام نیست. معلوم شد که ما اسلام شناس داریم که ابعاد اسلام شناسی اضافه میشه، فردا بگینم اسلام شناس میشه و شده است. هی میگن موافق اسلام نیست. اسلام چطور؟ و شما که اسلام نمیدونید با صاد میمیسن یا با سین میمیسن.
There were other disagreements too. Ali Shariati wasn't too fond of clerical rule. If he had lived to see the aftermath of the revolution, the role of clerics in politics would have been a point of tension between him and Khomeini. Despite the disagreements, Muslim revolutionaries were united in their opposition to imperialism, the Zionist colonization of Palestine, and the Shah. They saw the three as part of the same whole, and all of this happened in the context of the non-aligned movement and the larger decolonization movement around the globe. As Iranians made their revolution, several countries in Asia and Africa gained their political independence from Western states. After the Shah left the country in January of 1979, Ayatollah Khomeini used his position as the widely recognized leader of the revolution to make Iran according to his vision. He drew on his large social base to institutionalize clerical rule at the domestic level. He also tried to fight imperialism and Zionism at the international level. This fight included coordination with Lebanon's Shias, who eventually formed into the largest militia in the world, Hezbollah, fighting Israel to this day. One of Ayatollah Khomeini's crucial revolutionary creations was the Revolutionary Guard. Khomeini had learned from Mossadegh's mistake and probably from other failed revolutions in the Third World. There were many instances of Third World governments who tried to nationalize industries and break away from imperialist control. But the Western imperialists, having trained the country's armed forces, would coordinate with the army to reverse nationalization and undo the revolution. After all, political leadership and promises meant little if not backed by the forces who shot the guns and operated the tanks. This is where the Revolutionary Guard came to play a role. The Guards recruited from among the most fervent supporters of the revolution and operated separately from the Iranian army. But soon they came to overpower the army. Their steadfast loyalty to Ayatollah Khomeini and the revolution made it practically impossible for the Americans to orchestrate another coup and bring Iran back into their orb. Another important base for Khomeini's vision was the Islamic Republic Party. The party was composed mainly of lower-ranking clerics. It organized average supporters into an organization called the Comité. By the end of the summer of 1979, comités were active in almost all population centers. They enforced law and order and the rules of the Sharia. There were Khomeini loyalists who disrupted the activities of other political groups, often using physical intimidation. They included the Chomagdaran or the club wielders. As the name says, they bore batons ready to confront anyone perceived to be an anti-revolutionary. There were also the Hezbollahis, who happened to share their name with Lebanon's Hezbollah. They pursued Khomeini's vision with revolutionary and religious zeal. As all of this was happening, Iran was also fighting the Western-backed government of Saddam Hussein in Iraq, a war that lasted from 1980 to 1988 and cost at least 500,000 lives between the two countries. Many who were killed in the front lines were volunteer soldiers and the same fervent supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini.
جانم فدای ایران قال انشالله قربون ایران برید شما. اما کی تا حالا شما این هیئت ها، این تیپ های اینجوری کی تا حالا در مقابل دشمنان ایران سینه سپر کردن؟ در مقابل دشمن ایران هم همین جوان حزب اللهی با سینه سپر کرده، جوان انقلابی سینه سپر کرده. 300,000 شهید دوران دفاع مقدس کیا بودن؟ بعد از اون شهدایی که ما داشتیم کیا بودن؟ همین بچه‌های مؤمن و انقلابی بودن که از کشورشون دفاع کردن در مقابل ضد انقلاب، در مقابل مهاجم خارجی، در مقابل آمریکا. شما کی قربون ایران رفتید که میگید فدای ایران؟
Throughout the 1980s, Ayatollah Khomeini and his Islamic Republic Party consolidated their power and marginalized or eliminated other parties, including the Liberation Movement and the so-called American Muslims, who were less hostile to Western powers. Starting in the 1990s, the Islamic Republic Party became divided over key political issues. Some high-ranking party members were in favor of greater integration into the US-led global economy, while others thought that it would make Iran too dependent and undermine the momentum of the revolution. There were also disagreements on individual rights, such as the freedom of women and the issue of mandatory hijab. Some thought that these individual choices were incompatible with the cultural values of the revolution, while others saw no major conflict. These disagreements divided the political class into different camps, most prominently into the reformists and the principalists, with the former practicing greater openness towards liberalism.
Suspicions and miscalculations have created many wars between nations. Leaders must try to remove these walls.
So you're saying you want to tear down the wall of mistrust?
The wall which is called mistrust, the wall which is called suspicion, the wall called miscalculation, should all be torn down, and an atmosphere of friendship and kindness should be established among all nations.
Supporters of liberalism clashed with the political approach of the current leader of the revolution, Ayatollah Sayyid Ali Khamenei. He became the Wali Faqih, or the supreme jurist, after Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989. Since then, he has remained steadfast in the fight against imperialism and Zionism, and is pretty committed to the policies of military and economic sovereignty, with its emphasis on national production.
اونجوری که من به عنوان توقع از دولت محترم، مسئولان محترم و مردم عزیزمون امسال مطرح میکنم، باز یک مسئله اقتصادی است. این هم شعار امسال خواهد بود، مسئله اقتصادی ما، و اون مربوط به سرمایه گذاری در اقتصاد. البته سرمایه گذاری عمدتاً از سوی مردم باید انجام بگیره، لکن در اون جایی که مردم یا انگیزه‌ای ندارند یا توانایی سرمایه گذاری ندارند، دولت هم میتوانه در این میدان وارد بشه، نه به عنوان رقابت با مردم بلکه به عنوان جایگزین مردم.
Now, the Islamic Republic continues to have a social base who comes out during rallies in support of the leader and the revolution. Opposition media often claims that the social base is bussed into rallies rewarded with food and sandis, the domestic Capri Sun brand. But these claims are pretty exaggerated. After all, even working class people can afford Capri Suns. Many Iranians, and definitely those who show up to these protests, do genuinely support the Islamic Republic. And when they say death to America, England, and Israel, they really mean it. They really want an end to US imperialism and Israeli settler colonialism. Within the supporters of the Islamic Republic, there are also people who have fundamental disagreements with the Islamic Republic system, established by Ayatollah Khomeini. For example, some believe that the supreme jurist shouldn't hold so much political power, or that the leader position should be abolished altogether. However, they still have some vague allegiance to the Islamic Republic and they participate in elections. This oppositional class, especially inside Iran, are distinct from the hardline opposition in the diaspora who boycott elections and lobby Western governments for sanctions, war, and regime change against Iran. The supporters of the Islamic Republic are diverse demographically. Some are the working poor, others are middle-class families, and then there are the upper middle class and upper classes, many of whom find economic mobility or newfound privileges after the revolution. Remember the Revolutionary Guard I mentioned? Many of the wealthier families are members of the Revolutionary Guard, which over time grew larger and larger, becoming, in addition to the country's most powerful armed force, also an economic powerhouse. Many of these families are surely wealthy. However, contrary to misinformation coming from the Western media, they don't live in an apartheid-style system segregated from the rest of the population. It's just like capitalism elsewhere in the world. People with more money have access to nicer housing and facilities. Not all wealthy, state-affiliated families hold strong revolutionary values. There are state-affiliated families who travel to the West or send their children for education, but they're not the ideological type committed to revolutionary values. Most are crony capitalists whose ultimate allegiance is to wealth and power and who want to push Iran further down the neoliberal path. So, the supporters of the Islamic Republic are diverse in their political positions and in demographics. Whether the Islamic Republic system will maintain the vision of Khomeini and Khamenei in the long term remains a question. The Iranian rial has fallen to new lows in recent years and inflation keeps rising. A new deal with Trump, if it happens, would likely include Iran giving up some of its deterrent abilities, especially its nuclear activities and military support for regional Muslim militants fighting Israel. Iran, under the leadership of Khamenei, will not be willing to do this. However, there are more liberal elements within the country who are willing to trade economic integration and foreign investment for abandoning the anti-imperialist policies of the last 45 years. If they win, the most formidable regional challenge to Zionism would turn into a country run by a pragmatic, military capitalistic elite who would abandon the Palestinian struggle. But if there's an attack on Iran, as Trump has threatened in case of negotiations falling through, the demographic that supports the Islamic Republic will certainly strengthen to see another day. Such an attack might even bring the demographic who loves the West to the defense of the country.